Hey, fantastic. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Welcome to Learning in the Age of Climate Change, Part 3. This is our third part in our climate series hosted by the Yale Alumni Educators Group. Our goal for tonight is to explore ways that teachers can meaningfully incorporate climate change into both humanities and STEM curriculum. And tonight we're going to be focusing specifically on secondary classrooms, though there's applications kind of up and down age ranges. Our hope is that you'll leave tonight with a better understanding of how some of us are approaching climate change education with students, and that those of you who are educators or connected to schools will leave with ideas that you can bring back to your own contexts. So I'll be serving as our moderator tonight. My name's Tom James. I'm a 12th year educator. I graduated from Yale in 2012, studied computer science and math, and did the Yale teacher prep program. I've been teaching high school math since then. I currently serve as the interim assistant head of high school at Grace Church School in New York City. And I'm going to turn it over to Elissa and then Mike to introduce themselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elissa Levy. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a high school physics teacher in Northern Virginia. For most of my teaching career, I lived in New York City. So I taught in the New York City public school system for 6 years, and I now teach in Virginia. I have incorporated climate change in physics, in particular in my energy unit. And I also taught for a while at the High School for Climate Justice. So we had a lot of partnerships with organizations and just connected in many ways around making climate part of the entire curriculum. Mike, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Elissa. My name's Mike Fishback. I'm Yale class of '01, majored in political science. Oh, my pronouns are he, him. I've been a teacher at independent and charter schools for the last 20 plus years. And I currently teach at Almaden Country Day School in San Jose, California, teaching middle school. And I'm a humanities teacher. I'm a social studies and language arts teacher. And I'm looking forward to talking today about how humanities teachers can incorporate climate education and climate action into their work.
So I feel really blessed to have both Elissa and Mike here with us tonight. Elissa and I overlapped at Yale, and Mike and I were colleagues a while back when we taught at the Potomac School, and they're both really thoughtful educators, and I'm really glad we have a representative from humanities and STEM here with us tonight. So we're going to dive into some questions for both Elissa and Mike. And folks in the audience, there's going to be time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to pop questions in the chat as they come up, and I can kind of tailor the conversation based on this group's interest as well. And I also want to say at the outset that myself, Elissa, and Mike have all been really fortunate in that the schools we've taught at have generally been quite supportive of the work we've done around climate education. But mileage might vary based on your local context and constraints. So just keep that in mind. And I'm hoping that we're going to get some ideas for how you might be able to move the needle, regardless of kind of the situation that you're working with. But why don't we start off, Mike, I'll turn it to you first. Why do you teach about climate change? Do you do it because you have to? What's the deal?
So I'm fortunate that I'm at a school where I don't have to teach about anything. Well, I have to teach about something. I get to create my curriculum. We're an independent school, so we can base it on Common Core. We base it on our California state standards, but I and my colleagues get to craft our curriculum. The reason I incorporate climate change and climate action is because it's what the kids care about. It's what they are worried about, and it's what I'd like them to be able to be proactive about now and in the course of their lives. And as I talk later about what it is I do in my humanities classes, it really it bubbles up from the kids. So I am not directly teaching about climate change, but I'm giving kids the structures so that they can explore it and think about how they want to solve the problem. I think it's really important that whatever curriculum we teach, and whether we're adapting something that comes from top down or whether we're creating something from the bottom up, that it be responsive to what the kids are facing in their lives, that it be responsive to the kids' own not just interests, but worries, because sometimes we keep that silent in schools, and it's important that we help them face their worries, and that's part of what a great curriculum can do.
Thanks, Mike. Elissa, how about you? Why do you teach about climate change?
Yeah, so climate change is one of the biggest existential threats to humanity right now. We have, over the past few decades, figured out as a species what is in store for us in this planet if we continue to operate the way we are in terms of fossil fuels, adding carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, et cetera. And in addition, right, the effects are felt disproportionately by those who come from marginalized backgrounds. And so, like, it exacerbates the inequity that is already a problem across our planet. So you must be informed as citizens, right? Like, the world will be inherited by our students, and they need to be prepared and ready to do something, right? In terms of whether it's a mandate, there are a few states that have incorporated climate change into their standards. New Jersey most recently has a requirement to teach climate change across areas, and New York does not. When I was in New York, I was working with a group called CRETF, Climate Resilience Education Task Force. Shout out to Tom Roderick. I saw that you're one of the attendees tonight. Tom is also involved with CRETF. They're working to get stuff, into schools in New York. Now I'm in Virginia. Virginia is far away from having mandated climate change curricula. It is, closer to the South than New York. And so I think in many cases, we're a coalition of teachers working independently across, finding each other through the void to figure out how to teach about climate change, how to make sure it's part of our curriculum, especially when materials aren't standardized and there's not a specific requirement.
I really appreciate how both of you are kind of responding to student need front and center. That, yes, like, we definitely think this is important, but also, like you said, Elissa, the students are the ones who are going to inherit this world. And they're feeling like they would be pushing us to talk about this if we weren't already. So, and like you mentioned, sometimes a lot of teaching can feel like doing things in silos, right? So if we are able to find some community among educators who are trying to kind of accomplish similar goals, that's really huge. And that's one hope I have for our conversation this evening. So that's a bit about the why you all teach about climate change. Let's get into the how. What does it look like within a humanities class or a STEM class, both on a unit level or just day-to-day lessons? Mike, let's start with humanities.
Yeah, so I incorporate climate change, or I let the kids incorporate climate change, right, into two of my classes. I teach a 7th grade world history, world cultures class, and I also teach an 8th grade United States government history class. And I'll talk a little bit about what happens in both, because for my 7th grade, the culminating project at the end of our year is a Model United Nations that the entire 7th grade at our school participates in. And it goes for about 5 weeks. And after studying about differences in cultures and histories of migration and colonialism and slavery and revolution and all of these things, now we're looking, our big essential question is how does the world try to come together to solve problems? And so we do that by having each student picks a country, they research a lot about the country, and then as a class, they pick 2 global issues that they're going to try to solve together as United Nations. Every single time I've taught this, the classes I've taught have picked climate change as their #1 issue. Not surprising. And so now I kind of design it anticipating it's a climate change project, right? It didn't start out that way. But over the years that I've done it, I've learned that, here are the things they need to research, right? What is their country's GDP and GDP per capita? What are the natural resources? What are their exports and imports? Because I know that what are the form of government, right? These things are going to come into play as they realize they're stuck in trying to solve this problem. And the way the United Nations works in our model of it is, and there's a lot of different ways to do Model UN, but they make speeches where each of the countries proposes a solution to the problem, in this case, climate change. They have formal negotiations in the General Assembly where they're using parliamentary procedure. And then they're also doing informal backroom negotiations, right, where they're building coalitions and blocks and figuring out how to make a deal with some other countries, maybe threaten some other countries, whatever the politics might be. And as they're doing this, they I've realized that they learn a few fundamental things. And again, it's really from the bottom up, where like I set the structure and I allow them to learn these things, right? I'm facilitating. And I made a list of some things as I was thinking, like what are they learning about climate change, right, through this? First is that countries put their interests first, even though they purport to care about the world, right? Especially fossil fuel exporters. So any of the Middle Eastern countries, Russia especially, right, will find ways in our model UN to slow down the process of like, what is the deadline by which we're going to be free of fossil fuels? Oh, but we can't do that. Our country is going to be ruined, right? So the self-interest of countries, countries are responsible for their own country first and foremost, and so it's hard to solve a collective action problem when you're thinking about your own people or country at least. Another is that alluding to what Elissa was saying about the exacerbating the inequities globally, that the countries that are most affected by severe global warming are often the countries that did the least to cause this problem. Countries this way. Every country needs to do this to combat climate change. And then some of the developing countries, those representatives will be like, wait a minute, like, why do I have to do this? I'm not the ones who have the history of all this oil use and everything. And so they'll start to debate that, and they'll realize in the moment that like, hey, there's this inequity. They also, this is something that I realized over the years that is really interesting and applies to middle school kids, maybe particularly, is that they realize the problem won't be solved on an individual level. So one example was, there was this girl last year who was representing Canada, and her proposal was to provide money, the UN would provide money so that everyone around the world would get educated in the importance of picking up litter. As if that was going to be like the thing that would solve global climate change, right? Because in our context, especially in like the world of relatively privileged American kids, what we often teach is like, oh, we'll all do our part. We're all gonna, clean stuff up and save water, and that's gonna save, right? And when you look at it on a global scale, and they're trying to solve it on a global scale, there's so much pushback in the room of like, our people in whatever country we're representing, like that's not going to make a difference to us when like the sea levels are rising and we're going to be climate refugees. Like picking up litter is going to be the least of our worries. So there's that kind of aha moment in the room. And then at some point they get into like the actual details of their resolution, and they're filling in the numbers. And so the more advantaged countries with more money will say, we're gonna commit to giving such amount of money or percent of our GDP, to solve this climate crisis. We're going to transfer money to countries that need it, who are going to be affected most by this, right? And so their heart's in the right place. And then the devil's in the details. Like, are they going to do they trust that country's government to use the money wisely? Because maybe that country is a dictatorship, or maybe, they're worried about whether that country is an enemy of their country for whatever other reason, right? Whose vision of what's going to happen? So there were some developed countries that wanted to use their money to build a rail line, because they know in our country, doing like high-speed rail is the solution we all say is like gonna solve the crisis, right? And then other countries would be like, wait, like we don't need a rail line when we really need to, very, very different fundamental structural solutions to be able to survive what's already happening in our countries. And so there's disagreement about like, how will this money be used? And then finally, when we do the cutoff, like every country with a GDP over this amount is going to contribute money, and every country with the GDP under this amount is going to receive. And then they start, like, countries at the cusp will try to negotiate the number down or up based on where they are, because they want to, again, it's like about their self-interest. And so it becomes this really interesting lesson on politics generally, right, and how legislating works, but also on like why it's so difficult for the whole world to get together, knowing that this is an existential threat to the planet, and actually solve this problem. And so we have all these layers of complexity that the kids understand and experience through this activity, and then the reflection at the end, they write about it. So that's, I know I've been rambling. That's what we do in 7th grade. How about I'll go into what we do in 8th grade later on in the conversation, because I want to hear about what Elissa does in STEM also.
Yeah, for sure. And I love Mike, something I really admire about you as an educator is that you're someone who really designs for students to experience the complexity that you could just tell them about, but they're not going to fully absorb it unless they experience that collective action problem, right? And see why, like, why have all the older people not solved this yet? Well, there's reasons it's hard. So Elissa, turning to you from the STEM perspective, how do you teach about climate change in your classroom?
Yes, I'll start by saying compared to the human, like negotiations, socio-political debate, right? Compared to all that, the science is easy, but also really important because all of what Mike just talked about is predicated on understanding that the knowledge we have points to this is where our planet is headed, and human beings are the cause. And that is what the majority of reputable scientists all agree. And in many parts of our country, it is not kind of generally understood by high school teachers, right? And so even you get questions like, oh, do you believe in climate change? Right? The idea that it's a thing you do or don't believe in. The question is, what is the preponderance of evidence? And given the evidence, what is the most likely explanation for things, right? And yes, our climate is complicated and hard to model, but we know enough to know that human beings are pretty definitely causing climate change and need to do something, right? So the question then is, how can students be equipped to argue this, right? To have these conversations with the adults in their lives and their peers and other folks who don't see that. And you have to be able to talk science in order to do that. So that's where I go. And I do it as the energy unit. So I'm a physics teacher, and one of our units is energy. Then the next, I guess, important thing to say is in the next generation science standards, which New York State followed, and so I grew up with NGSS as a teacher, you start with a phenomenon. So like, we're going to learn about gravity. I'm going to start with a phenomenon of I drop a beach ball and a golf ball at the same time, and the golf ball hits the ground first. But then I drop, a golf ball and a tennis ball at the same time, and they hit the ground at the same time, right? Here's a phenomenon. Now we have to work our way through and build up a model to explain it. So when I teach energy, the phenomenon is climate change. And so I'll share screen. I have the slides that I used. This is one of the more consolidated versions. Oh, that's the Q&A. I'll close that. So this is what students get presented with. Here are some graphs. Atmospheric carbon dioxide over time, global average surface temperature over time, sea ice over time. And then students write down questions they have. Are these things related? What's the cause? Is this randomness or is this real? And in order to answer all of that, in an ideal world, we're spending a month or a semester, but what inevitably happens in my physics class is it's a week or two because there's other content I'm required to cover, right? We can frame the energy unit around climate change, but I definitely don't have freedom and space to go as deep without it being a specific climate elective. So where do we go from here? They ask a bunch of questions, and then it's all inquiry-driven science experiences. So I make them rub their hands together vigorously. What do you observe? What types of energy are there? So this is results from a workshop I did. And then they do energy pie charts. So how do you map the story of energy? How does energy move and transform over time? What is thermal energy? Happy to talk about more of this, but I'm going to kind of gloss over stuff for now. But various experiments to talk about what thermal energy is, what is heat, what is light, like what is the relationship between light and heat, what type of energy do we get from the sun? And so they start to build a model of, oh, the sun shines on the earth. And so that light energy that came from the sun gets absorbed by matter, turns into heat, radiates back. And then what happens if not all of it gets a chance to radiate back? So more about heat and light. And then we talk about, okay, well, what might cause not all of the energy that we get from the sun to be able to go back into outer space. And that is greenhouse gases. And so what does that mean? And also there's a lot of confusing language, right? Conservation of energy is the opposite of you must conserve energy. And so we talk about like, right, what does it mean to consume energy? Energy can't get consumed. It just changes form. And so being able to start to map, where does our energy come from? In a physics class, you hear things like gravitational potential energy and kinetic energy and chemical energy and radiant energy. But like, what does that mean in terms of nuclear, coal, biofuel, right? So we do that mapping. And then we'll talk about in terms of a city. So we analyze these Sankey diagrams. So if you take, and there's a whole bunch from Lawrence Livermore Labs, every state in the country, you know, multiple countries in the world, where their energy comes from, where it goes. And then once you do that and you start to talk about how certain types of energy generation produces CO2 as a byproduct, then that helps you understand why we talk about clean energy, what renewable energy means, and what how this all gets affected. So then we go into the physics of why do greenhouse gases trap energy? What does that mean and how does that work? So it's all the science. And then once you've got the greenhouse effect, the whole thing comes together in analyzing Earth's energy budget. So that's kind of the arc of how climate becomes the framing really for my energy unit. And then like, if I have time, I go into things like En-ROADS and C-ROADS, which get more at what Mike's talking about, right? How do you do negotiations? How do you think about the socio-political implications? But it's not often that I have the space for that in my course because it's a STEM focused class. And so I'm really focused on the science.
Right. And there's so much science and it's so rich and so important for students to understand, which is why it's so important that this not be siloed in any one particular field. So, Elissa, if we stick with you, like, what do you hope students will take away from learning about climate change? And, you know, how can you tell that change is taking place?
Yeah, so I think at a minimum, it's what Mike was saying before. It's funny. I was looking at an article that I wrote while Mike was talking, and the last line is a student saying, "I had always thought that climate change was because people don't recycle, but I get it now." And Mike was saying the same thing, right? It's this really common trope among American students that like recycling is somehow the solution. And so it's just baseline knowledge, right? Is understanding absolutely there are things we can do, but even being able to calculate how much effect will I have by recycling compared to how much effect I'll have by cutting out meat, which produces a lot of greenhouse gas, right? So just even knowing that is the type of calculation that's worth doing is really important, I think, for my students, and to be able to explain generally how the energy flows work on our planet and why our planet is habitable and what are the things we're doing to make it less habitable, as well as like I don't want to ignore either the social justice pieces, like just because I'm a science teacher, right? We absolutely can and should go there because the purpose of science is to serve humanity. So being able to articulate not only the mechanisms of climate change, but also who's the most impacted and why, I think is important for me.
Yeah, you know,
pick up from there.
Oh, sorry. As you were saying that, Elissa, it reminded me. So in our 7th grade class earlier in the year, we studied about differences in like cultural belief systems. And so I think last year, the year before, the student who was representing India in our Model United Nations, her proposal was to have her country send out people from India across the world to teach everyone else in the world how to cook vegetarian recipes. Because the idea of exactly what you're saying, right? You know, that's one of the huge contributors, like methane gas and animal agriculture, you know, and so here, India, because of its way of thinking about animals, has a largely vegetarian cuisine, and here's how we're going to. So I think one of my answers to your question, Tom, is one of the things I think, what I hope and I think, reading their writing, my students get out of it is first of all, how interconnected so many world issues are, and then how you can leverage the strengths of different areas of the world, different cultures, different values to try to work together to combat the climate crisis. It would be easy in a geopolitical simulation like the Model UN to leave the kids feeling totally hopeless because, oh wow, we had these ambitions and now they're not getting fulfilled, and everything gets diluted. And my first year doing it, actually, I did have a few classes just fail and were not able to pass a climate resolution with enough support. And I realized the difference when I read the students writing and just heard them talking afterward, the feeling of just dispiritedness in those classes versus the other. So what I do now is make sure that each class, I find a way for each class to have some success, so they can see that they've made not the progress they wanted. Powerful countries blocked certain things, as they do, right? But that they were able to, either with a narrower issue or maybe slightly different numbers, they were able to decide together as a world on something. And so they can see a path to how that can happen, and they can see how each country and each society, no matter their wealth and no matter their status in the world global hierarchy or whatever, can contribute to helping each other solve this problem. And so from the social science standpoint, like that's what I want them to come away with, and I think it's what a lot of them do come away with.
What sort of reactions do you get from students, either by going through, this sort of proposal generation, resolution generation process, seeing it succeed or not, or like Elissa mentioned, seeing side by side the impact of different choices? Like, what is the range of student response that you see?
I just got a note last week from an alumna of my class, who wrote that starting in 7th grade with the Model United Nations, that's what made her realize she wanted to go into public service and improve the world, and that she saw the impact she could have. And I like to think each time I get a note like that, that's representative of kids who aren't writing to their teachers. And sometimes it's frustrating being a teacher because you don't always know the impact that you have, and you don't know whether what you're doing is working. You see it working on like maybe test scores or whatever, but you don't know that it works beyond that. Like, how are you actually impacting people's lives? And I think, as I said at the beginning, like the more you're teaching things that matter to the kids already and that they know are important, the more of an impact you're going to have as a teacher, because you're connecting with them through that. And if you're teaching something valuable or getting them to realize something valuable that they can then use and apply in their lives, you're having that impact. And so, at the very least, the kids say it's fun, which is a compliment for middle schoolers, right? But I think it's more than fun. It's meaningful and complex. And I think the reason it's fun is because of how challenging it is for them to do. And they really, so like, we do other, they vote on other topics too. So like last year they were solving the drug trafficking problem and global hunger and women's and girls' rights. And, I had lunch duty one day at the lunch tables during Model UN, and this table was, I got there a little late and I just wandered over, and this table was in the middle of talking about Russia and Ukraine and their war and how that was going to impact what different classes positions were on drug trafficking. That was their social conversation, because when you design an activity that matters to the kids, it's what their conversations are about. What much curriculum does, especially mandated curriculum that's designed by a committee somewhere, is that it's because it's designed by committee, because it's meant to not provoke anything, it's just meant to be as bland as possible. Of course, kids aren't going to be talking about it outside of class, because why would you? So when you have the opportunity to design something, you can design it with that in mind, with like what's meaningful to the kids.
I'll add also that you often don't know what will be meaningful. So in New York, it was not really easy to see the effects of climate change on a day-to-day basis, like arguably milder winters, right? And then when I was teaching in New York City in early June, the sky turned orange from the wildfires in Canada. And there were a couple days and school was closed for a day. And it
Yeah, I
was,
remember that.
right?
Yeah.
Students reacted to that, right, Tom?
That was, yeah, it was wild. They had real questions about what was happening.
And so like we had done our, energy climate unit a few months prior. And so I said, all right, tossing today's lesson, let's go back to what we did a few months ago. Who can explain what's going on? Right. And it was a combination of things, because that wasn't specifically what's the mechanism of climate change, right? That's a second and third order consequence of climate change, dryness resulting in more forest fires. And now, how does a forest fire in Canada result in an orange sky in New York City? And so, like, unpacking the scientific explanation of that, like, that's complex stuff. And when you take kind of cookie cutter science curricula, like, it doesn't deal with messiness like that, right? Every piece of that story exists in a science curriculum somewhere, but it's handed to the students. And so when you give them the complicated thing, right, it took us a whole class period to even begin to pick apart why the sky was orange. Like, and how do we see color? Why does it look orange, right? There's what size are the particles in the sky? And now suddenly we care about particle size. It's not a thing I cared about before June of this year. Although maybe a little with COVID, I did care about particle size. And so it's relevant, but it's messy. And so it's a great opportunity to help students see how messy the real world is and what it means to engage at all of these levels at the same time. And I'll say, adding to Mike's comment about it being a genuine experience, when I taught my juniors last year, I said to them, we're going to do climate for a week. It was the week before Christmas break. And I said, look, I'm the only physics teacher leaning this hard into climate. I want to be aligned with the other physics teachers, so none of this goes into your grade, right? All you have to do is show up and like pretend you're listening, right? But none of the climate stuff gets incorporated in your grade. And then I had a student, I was writing a college rec letter for them. And one thing they said to me, oh, as you prepare this letter, one thing I really appreciated from your class was I was so prepared to sleep through climate week in your physics class. I was so excited to have nothing that was going to be assessed the week before Christmas break. And 2 minutes in, I was like, oh, this is the most important thing we've learned yet. I was like, yeah. So, right, there's an element of when the students realize why they should care, they care.
Yeah, and I think both of you have just done an incredible job at finding those hooks for students, right? To kind of connect to their personal interest here. And I think about people who are looking to do more of this in their work and maybe have encountered different obstacles, because I think both of you have gone, you're both experienced educators. You didn't just start with this. So I think it might be helpful if you could talk about some obstacles you might have experienced with teaching about climate justice in your subject area and how you kind of moved through those.
I can start.
Go for it.
Unless you want to, Mike.
No, go for it.
So I had a very smooth start to teaching about climate because during the pandemic, so in 2020, the school where I was teaching decided to rename itself. We went from being Life Sciences Secondary School to the High School for Climate Justice. And I had not previously really thought that much about what climate might look like in my curriculum. Now it was a mandate for this particular school. And I was really excited because I hadn't thought about how it would go in my curriculum. I reached out to basically every organization I knew about in the New York area and started attended meetings of Citizens Climate Lobby, New York Renews, CRETF, which I mentioned before, spoke to like We Act and New York Sunworks, all these organizations, right, that do climate curriculum. And I attended all the teacher workshops anyone offered, and it was all supported by my school. So when I ultimately said I've gotten all the education that I can find on this topic, and here's how I want to teach it, the answer was, of course, do it. It's wonderful. We want more. And then, and I did see there's a question in the chat, which I'm sure, Tom, you were going to ask later, but it was about collaborating across departments. Tons of collaboration time, right? I met with all the other departments. It's like, okay, so in your English class, you're going to read this climate dystopian novel. And in parallel, I'm going to do my energy unit with the same students. So now we can refer to these things and even ask questions that show that, look, this novel you're reading is about the same implications we're talking about in Elissa's science class. So that's the opposite, right, of Tom's question. Tom's question is, what are the challenges? So, but I do want to describe what it looks like when it goes well, because that is how you overcome the challenges, right? So when you end up in a school, which I've also experienced, where it's not a priority, or it's hard for teachers to find each other and collaborate with each other, the question is, how do you create that thing I described? And it might be social media. It might be teacher communities online. There's a ton of professional development opportunities, both on Zoom and in person, some of which is funded. And so it's about finding those places where there are like-minded folks developing curricula, and then also finding champions within the school community who support your doing of the work.
Yeah, so both definitely within your building, but even if that's hard to find, tons of online, like communities of teachers using the internet to connect with each other. Mike,
yeah, I've also found that my school has been supportive of my work. And what I described in the Model 9 Nations has been relatively, controversy free. Actually, this is a good time to explain just for a moment what I do in 8th grade around climate action, because this is trickier. In 8th grade U.S. history, it's a political science tool that I didn't learn about in college because I don't think it existed yet, but it's called the Overton window. And the idea is that there is a range of acceptable debate on an issue that politicians and policymakers have to maneuver within. And the role of an activist is to make a radical demand about something that is unlikely to actually happen and be fulfilled. But what they do over time, as they're more vocal and more, people pay attention to them, is they shift that window, that Overton window of what's acceptable debate. And so I use climate action as one of the topics in which to introduce this, and actually have an interactive model, and I'll show you. Let me share my screen really quickly. So this is a slide that I give my kids, and so here's the Overton window for climate change. And the middle ground, the thing that used to be or has been policy for a while, is basically oil companies write laws in America. And as you go more to the right, more oil extraction and discouraging renewable energy, you can see these are the things that are sensible, popular, acceptable. And as you go outside the boundaries of the window, it's radical, unthinkable, right? Not too long ago, subsidizing electric cars with taxpayer money was a radical idea. And then banning gas cars altogether was like, what? Kids can actually shift the Overton window, right? On the slide, because of a lot of climate activism, the window is now kind of, I would say, here, where right now the debate is about how much money should we use to subsidize electric vehicles. And then in California, we've entered the debate about which year is the right year to ban the sale of gas cars. Is it 2035? Is that too early? Should it be only banning gas cars, the sale of gas cars? Should it be having them off the road? That is an acceptable debate on the fringes still, but not unthinkable. And so that's a model that I use for, and then I have the kids go and pick an issue and map their Overton window about where did it start, what did activists do, what was their strategy, and where did they shift the window, and they can expand and contract it and move it wherever. And And so this is a way to teach the politics of climate change in America, which, as Elissa alluded to before, is tricky because there's a lot of people who don't believe it's a real issue, right? That's trickier because our school has a diversity of political ideologies in it. And so the way I do it is by teaching about here is what's contentious, and here's how actors try to play a role. So I'm taking myself and any opinions I might have out of it and just say, like, here's how the system works. You pick an issue, whether it's conservative or liberal or whatever, and show how activists could be anti-abortion activists. It could be gun rights activists, whatever those activists are, how they shift the terms of debate. So that's one way I've found to make it safer for me to at least expose eighth graders in this case to what the politics of climate justice are in climate action and climate justice are in America, and why they can be hopeful, even though it always seems so dire. So that's one thing I thought of as you were asking that question.
Do either of you have advice for how you might recommend a colleague proceed if there was perhaps less institutional support or maybe a bit more pushback from the student body? What advice would you give that person?
And it's a thing I think about a lot. I'm also on the editorial board of the underrepresentation curriculum. And so we've got materials for talking about race and underrepresentation more broadly in science classes. And it's a tricky one, right? We get a lot of educators coming to us and saying, I don't feel supported in this work. How can I do this? And honestly, like, I am not so strongly activist minded that I would ever encourage someone do something that would jeopardize their job, right? So if presenting things in a certain way in your classroom is going to result in you not being able to teach somewhere, like, no, we need you. We need you in the classroom. We need teachers. Don't lose your job. And then the question is, right, how do you do the work within the space in which you find yourself? And it can be small. It can absolutely be small. There's always little ways to bring things up. And as Mike mentioned, I think a great one is, here are the different perspectives people have, make your own determination. In science class, it's, we're going to, instead of analyzing, a light shining on a piece of paper, we're going to analyze the sun shining on pavement. And so it's right, as it's analogous. It's what the other classes are doing. It's the same thing, but now there's a nuance there. And so it's about finding those places where you can insert and add and make that conversation begin to happen, without alienating or anything like that. But then the question is, right, where's the support for that? And so to me, it's all about online communities. I actually haven't found a social media community related to climate. If you are specifically a physics teacher, there's an energy and equity portal, which has a lot of lessons related to energy and equity, to incorporate climate change in physics. But it really varies. And honestly, Google has been my best friend. There's a few ways you can go about it. You can do it through partnerships with organizations, so field trips, things like that, or activism, versus in a more direct curricular approach. And so, like, yeah, there's a ton of stuff out there if you Google.
I saw there's also a question in the chat about what sort of climate scientists or climate communicators that you personally follow or recommend, which kind of dovetails into a broader question about where to get resources to teach about climate change.
I'll defer to Elissa on these because I'm not teaching directly about climate change. And it was kind of my answer to the last question too, which is my recommendation is to provide structures, safe structures for kids to discuss research and discuss things that they consider to be problems. And if you've built a classroom where kids feel safe to bring things up that they're thinking about, and you have a really clear and strong structure of how the discussions are going to happen so that there's no ganging up on people, and that people feel like there's an opportunity for their voice to be heard and respected and responded to. If that is set up, then the kids will bring up the things that matter to them and that are important, and they know what's important. But I'll defer to Elissa because I don't follow a lot of climate specific people because I'm teaching more about government, and I'm using climate as a topic to have them think about.
I would have been much better positioned to answer this question 6 months ago. So the science teacher community, at least the people I know, have left Twitter. And that was where I did all of my following and all of my keeping up to date on things. And I no longer even remember the names of the amazing climate scientists I had been following. The one name that does come to mind is Emily Atkin, Atkin, who writes Heated, Heated. And that's a newsletter that I've been subscribing to. But other than that, because I've lost my Twitter community, there's no one I'm regularly following. And I really am reliant on word of mouth when people come across articles and things like that.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you,
loss
Elon,
of the
for the
Twitter
electric
community.
cause, but not for ruining Twitter.
I know. The loss of the Twitter teacher community has been really painful. I encourage folks to put any questions in the chat because we've got about 12 more minutes. There's a really good one here about a lot of climate scientists, teachers have been challenged to address climate anxiety in young people, right? So kind of like balancing the need for hope and optimism with the reality of the impacts of climate change. How have you helped students or yourself kind of navigate this?
Well, first I'll refer to everyone to our first two webinars in our Learning in the Age of Climate Change series, which are both to some extent, especially the first one about climate anxiety. I don't, Elissa, do you have anything specific as a response to that question? That's a great question.
I do actually have something specific. I'll share screen. This is a barometer I use with students. It's a screenshot from an article, but so I developed this when I was working at the High School for Climate Justice because I was noticing the demoralization that Mike was also talking about. And so I turned this into a survey and asked them where they would put themselves, because where my students put themselves affects the way I teach the next lesson. And if they're really all on the left, like I'm not convinced it's a problem I should care about, that's a very different lesson than I despair. And so to the extent that I'm doing a climate lesson that's longer, there's checkpoints where I'm asking them how they feel, because you have to calibrate. And then someone once told me, a now friend but mentor of mine, on the question of how to help students do activism, is you always have to end with hope, no matter what your lesson arc is. Let's say you only have 5 minutes to do a lesson on climate. The first 4 minutes might be doom and gloom, but that last minute, right, you have to end on hope, whether it's a project the students have created and spend months implementing, or like just a sentence, right? Like there has to be something at the end that gives us something to work towards. And I'd be curious, I don't know much about the social science research, but my intuition would be that if students believe that they can make a difference, they're more likely to try. And so that's really important.
Yeah, totally. And that it's similar with what I've learned over the years, which is now I'm designing the experiences with climate change to make sure that the main takeaway is, here is how people like me can make a difference. In my 8th grade with the Overton window, it's about how I can make a difference now with my voice, how I can pressure people who are in power and make my voice heard. And they're not going to do everything I want, but they will move in my direction. If enough of us are like I showed that viral video when the kids from the Sunrise Movement went into Senator Feinstein's office and to berate her about why she hadn't done enough, and she was in her 80s then, and she lectured them about, she's been around, she knows what she's doing, and they're like, but our plan. And then they made it viral, and that's it had an impact on Feinstein's career, and it also elevated those kids, right, and other kids who were trying to take action, that to show examples. And then also going back to what we said before about, yeah, recycling isn't the silver bullet, but when all of us do what we can and we're all modeling for each other how to do things, that those things do matter. They're not going to fix the problem on their own, but we don't want to make kids feel like those things you've been taught to do because it helps, don't bother doing it because it really doesn't make a difference. It's a collective action problem, but you are part of it always, and there are all sorts of things you can do in all aspects of your life to work on fixing the problem.
Right. And it's better to talk about it than to not talk about it, because it is a point of anxiety for a lot of young people. I can share briefly about my own school. We have an entire kind of program baked into our schedule where students are taking a variety of classes outside of their core academic classes. And they take classes on a number of themes, including things like social justice and health and wellness. But one of those themes is sustainability. And that's kind of like a 4-year arc within our school. So it's a conversation that students are constantly having about what is within their locus of control, to your point, Mike, both in terms of personal behavior, but also influencing broader social change. Thinking about the role of educators in this work, what needs to happen to increase the number of teachers who bring climate change into their classrooms across the country? Or what kind of advice would you offer to someone who's interested in starting?
What needs to happen structurally? I mean, yeah, none of us are going to be able to do that, but
how can we push the Overton window, Mike?
I think, yeah, right. Thank you. I think as I talked about before, I think one of as Elissa was saying, how like when there's the orange sky, we've had orange skies here in Northern California too, that there is so much, like the whole curriculum is here in the world. Like you don't have to have a curriculum in advance. You just bring the kids outside and you can teach them about everything, right? And the problem with how our American education system thinks about curriculum is that it's decided in advance. It's handed to teachers. It's handed to districts to then hand to teachers to then hand to kids. It's something that we deliver. And it's a body of content or skills that then we can assess for, and then we move on to something else. And I think like that is, not only does it not really help kids learn about all the things that there is in the world to learn about, but it also helps make learning and make these really pressing issues that are fascinating and worrisome feel like they're boring and bland and are just something you got to trudge through. And what I hope structurally can happen, and I don't know how that's going to happen, and it's one reason I teach in independent schools, because we're little islands where these things can happen, is to not have curriculum be thought of that way, to not have it be a top-down, committee-written, textbook-based learning experience, but instead empower teachers, train teachers in a way, and then empower them to be able to really like learn alongside their kids, be facilitators of their kids' curiosity, and really have the learning look like that, which is what a lot of higher education ends up looking like. And it's why so many people find that meaningful. but we feel like in order to do that, we got to like train all our kids in the basics. But the basics are complex too. And the way they get interested in it and the way they feel passionate about it and want to continue that is by really, having interactive learning experiences where they know what they're doing matters. So I don't know how it changes on a larger scale. People have tried, but I think that's what needs to happen.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Elissa, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Mike said it well. I have less to add. To just name the tension, right? There's the top down and the bottom up. And in terms of mandate, the moment you mandate something, it gets flat and bland. And the teachers I know who teach in New Jersey, where they are required to incorporate climate, it's not done meaningfully, right? Principals are saying, oh, just like shove something in there about climate and we can wave our hands and pretend we're doing what we're supposed to do. But that's not useful. That's not helpful. At the same time, though, if you take, all the teachers in the US, we're all going to agree to do climate, but we're not trained, we're not prepared, we don't know how, we don't have space, we don't have freedom, that doesn't work either. And so I think it's just going to have to continue the way it's continuing, with those who believe in the mission finding each other on social media, working together. Like I'm the three of us, right? Like we're here always looking to collaborate with people and just kind of keep shifting the Overton window now that we have that framework.
I also wonder if there's a way in which we can sort of collectively push the teaching culture that it's not just the science teacher's job, right? But like folks like Mike can say, actually, like there's a role for us humanity teachers, like as we come up as teachers, to be incorporating this within our curriculum as well.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, actually. And I'll I know there was a question in the Q&A about collaborating across disciplines, right? My previous school, which is a Title I charter school in San Diego, High Tech High, charter network, they're a project-based school, as many experimental schools are nowadays. And they're really about breaking down the disciplinary silos, and so many of the projects, and these are months-long projects that kids do, elementary, middle school, and high school level, are about climate science, climate justice. My daughter, when she was in kindergarten there, she did at the end of her kindergarten year, her class was at the Birch Aquarium in San Diego, and they each had researched something about microplastics in the ocean. And so she was there with her binder. She's 5 years old, and she is greeting people who had come to the aquarium just to visit that day and educating them about microplastics and what they can do. And like as a kindergartner, like that empowerment of those kids that I saw as a parent, and that I saw and did some of as a teacher involved in these projects, that I think can be the future of what our education system looks like, is more and more, because that is a mass movement in education now, of moving to project-based learning. That's where I think a lot of this can come from, is making it, yes, it's rooted in science, it's rooted in a lot of disciplines, and having climate education be a holistic enterprise, because it is a holistic subject and will only get solved holistically.
That's a great segue into a resource that someone put in the Q&A, which is the website subjecttoclimate.org, which has resources for climate education across the disciplines. Subjecttoclimate.org.
That's a good one. I haven't used it in a year or two, but I remember really appreciating it when I was there.
So I think we're about out of time. But Elissa and Mike, I really appreciate you being here tonight and just sharing your experience across both the STEM and the humanities, how you're working with students and on climate education, really incredible things. And I'm really appreciative for this conversation here tonight.
Tom, thank you for hosting. And also Modesta as well. Without the support of YAA, we would not have all of these amazing Zoom capabilities and registration, and also this will be posted online for those of you who are not watching us live. So thank you to Modesta and YAA as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we have more of this series coming up. So be on the lookout for that. There'll be advertisements in your social media. And if you're on the Alumni Educators list, you'll also get notifications about it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.